Now that we've talked about some examples of SPIs, let me come back and give a more detailed definition of what an SPI really is. First of all, you've noticed that I'm pronouncing this SPI rather than saying SPI. I recommend you use SPI instead of SPI. And the reason for that is I used to say SPI, and then I met with some government officials in Washington, D.C., and they asked me quite seriously what the Central Intelligence Agency had to do with autonomous vehicle safety, and I realized what the confusion was. So I recommend you as well always use SPI rather than SPI. An SPI is a metric supported by evidence that uses a threshold comparison to condition a safety case claim. Now that's quite a mouthful, but let me break it down for you. By metric, we mean a measurement of performance or design quality or process quality, operational procedure conformance, etc. Some metric that has anything at all to do with life cycle that is relevant to safety. There also needs to be a threshold, some sort of acceptance test on a metric value. Now the notion of threshold here can be pretty loose. It can be an incredibly complicated function that computes whether or not the SPI value is in the safe zone or not in the safe zone. That's okay. But ultimately, it boils down to some sort of Boolean comparison that produces a true or a false. So the idea is you have a metric, and the metric is either good or not good. The threshold is often statistical. It's quite common to have some sort of SPI threshold that of the form, well, X is bad, but the SPI violation threshold occurs when X happens more often than so many events per billion miles, for example. And this is important because a particular event, while maybe very undesirable, might still be acceptable if it's extremely rare. So, for example, if you have a crash, saying that you have a crash doesn't necessarily mean your system is unsafe in terms of acceptable safety. It's if crashes happen too often that you have a problem. The perfect system that never crashes hasn't been built yet and probably never will be built. So it's all about the statistical numbers rather than the specific behavior over a very short period of time. There's some evidence. The data is used to compute the metric. So you have data from evidence, computing a metric, and that threshold comparison conditions a claim. So we're back to the safety case now. You've made a claim. We claim that such and such is true. And the such and such claim is not that it's true 100% of the time, but rather the claim is this is true to the degree that we get fewer than X undesirable events per billion miles, for example. So a threshold violation falsifies a specific claim in the safety argument, which means that the argument for that claim is potentially proven false by the SPI. Let me go back and look at that a different way. You have a claim, the following can never happen. But the SPI measures whether it actually happens. And if it actually happens, well, that claim must be false and something's wrong with your safety case. Anything that misses one of the above criteria is not an SPI, it's a KPI. In particular, if you have a KPI and you can't point to a specific claim in the safety case that is directly measured or potentially falsified by that KPI, then it's not an SPI. KPIs can be useful, but it's hard to relate them to actual safety outcomes. On the other hand, an SPI, by its very nature, is relevant to deciding whether your safety case makes sense, and that makes it some sort of indicator as to safety, or at least the validity of your safety case. The idea is if you have an SPI violation, part of your safety case is not as strong as you thought it was, and that should be a concern for safety.